Welcome to the debate. Today we're wrestling with, I think, one of the most critical tensions in modern American civic life. It's a tension that's really clearly laid out in the source material we're looking at, this foundational clash between, on one hand, protecting individual liberty, particularly freedom of conscience, religious expression, and on the other, ensuring comprehensive anti-discrimination and, well, equal access for all identity groups. The central question really boils down to this. How should a free society reconcile the need for robust protections of individual conscience and expression, that's the viewpoint prioritizing fundamental liberties, with the necessity of enforceable civil rights and guaranteed equal dignity, that's the viewpoint prioritizing equity and access. My position today will champion liberty protections and, importantly, the power of local democratic control in mediating rapid cultural change.
And I'll be focusing pretty intensely, actually, on the necessity of enforceable anti-discrimination laws that guarantee equal access. I mean, our goal really has to be ensuring that a person's identity, whether it's race, sexual orientation, gender identity, never determines their access to basic things like housing, employment, or, public accommodations. This isn't just some theoretical disagreement. It's genuinely a fight over tangible dignity. And the policy choices here, well, they've become incredibly polarized. One side sees government overreach, the other sees absolutely essential guarantees.
Okay, so let's define the liberty position a bit more clearly then. Our core thesis is essentially that a free society demands robust protections for religion, for speech, and also for parental authority. We maintain that these profound cultural disagreements we're seeing, they need to be mediated through local democracy, through genuine community discussion, not just imposed by, say, national courts or sweeping administrative mandates. We're primarily concerned, I'd say, with guarding against compelled speech and really supporting pluralism. We see this protection quite vividly, I think, in cases concerning custom expressive services, like the 303 creative case. The core legal principle here is really about differentiating between regulating conduct, which, is required of all businesses, meaning you have to serve all customers regardless of identity, and compelling speech.
That's forcing an artist or a speaker to create a custom expression that violates their deepest beliefs. We believe individuals shouldn't be forced to articulate or fund messages they fundamentally oppose. And furthermore, we insist that moral and health decisions for minors, those belong to parents, demanding transparency over school curriculum and clear parental notification rules.
I understand the philosophical distinction you're making there between conduct and speech, but I tend to frame the practical reality quite differently, placing dignity and, crucially, access right at the center. So the core thesis on this side is that equal opportunity requires robust nationwide anti-discrimination baselines. The government, in this view, must establish rules that ensure identity doesn't determine life outcomes. My real concern is that when protections are framed very broadly as religious liberty, they often function, in practice as a kind of license to discriminate. And this particularly affects the most vulnerable groups, like LGBTQ individuals. Anti-discrimination rules aren't some theoretical threat to freedom. They are the very mechanism for securing genuine freedom for historically marginalized communities by guaranteeing equal access in jobs, housing, healthcare. The essentials. If we permit broad carve-outs based simply on disagreement with a person's identity, well, we fundamentally undermine the promise of equal citizenship.
You call them baselines, but the moment those rules mandate speech or penalize sincerely held religious practice, they really stop being neutral rules of commerce and become requirements for ideological compliance. That's where the liberty problem truly begins, in my view. If we prioritize viewpoint diversity and race-neutral remedies, we really have to challenge the modern proliferation of anti-discrimination mandates that seem to focus on group preferences or even explicit quotas. This is where we see the most visceral reaction against policies that seem to stray from the ideal of equal treatment for all individuals, regardless of their background or identity. We have to ensure that any regulation intended to foster access doesn't, at the same time, chill diverse viewpoints and compel ideological conformity.
I just I fundamentally disagree that the primary harm we should be mitigating here is compelled speech, when the reality on the ground is so often denial of service or denial of opportunity. Let me be absolutely clear. Failure to enforce robust anti-discrimination laws creates tangible, real-world barriers. If a transgender person is denied housing, for example, or if a gay couple is refused public services, especially outside major metropolitan areas, that denial creates immediate and often catastrophic harm. The strength of the access-focused position, I think, lies in its commitment to ensuring dignity via enforceable civil rights protections. We update these protections, adding sexual orientation and gender identity, precisely because without those enforceable standards, exclusion just persists. If we allow overly broad exemptions, we risk returning to a world where your identity determines if you get housed or fed or employed.
Right, and that critique leads us directly to the practical vulnerability that's noted in the source material for the liberty-focused approach. If our policies emphasize conscience exemptions too much, they can read as purely exclusionary and, yes, create genuine health or legal risks, particularly in time-sensitive situations.
Exactly. We can't champion conscious protections without simultaneously demanding a specific functional answer for guaranteeing timely access where those exemptions are granted. So the core question becomes, how do we marry a legitimate conscious protection, which should probably be reserved for genuinely expressive acts, with a rock-solid service guarantee?
Well, I think the material offers a highly pragmatic bridging idea here, which we can call live and let live compacts. Now, this isn't about general commerce. It's specifically about limited expressive services. The proposal details pairing religious conscience accommodations, reserved strictly for those custom expressive services like, say, designing a wedding website or a custom cake, with a rigorous, guaranteed access requirement. And this access guarantee, it isn't passive. It involves a mandatory time-bound referral or network obligation. So the objector must ensure the customer is immediately and successfully referred to an alternative provider who can meet their need within a specific time frame. This ensures the objector isn't compelled to participate in the expression they object to, yet simultaneously the customer is never actually denied essential or timely service. So the question is this compact structure a potentially viable middle ground for balancing both of these important values?
The concept, it has genuine merit, I'll grant that, because it correctly identifies that the public interest lies in guaranteed access, not simply in penalizing the dissenter. However, its viability hinges entirely on the details of that backstop. Let's be practical for a second. If a couple is refused service by maybe the only highly specialized vendor in a rural or conservative area, how quickly can that referral network truly guarantee an equivalent service? That delay is the harm. Who funds that network? Who regulates its timeliness and quality? If the time-to-service metric for protected groups significantly increases because of these referrals, then the compact, frankly, fails the test of equal dignity. So while I'm open to limited accommodations for genuinely expressive services, that accommodation cannot shift the burden of finding equivalent service onto the vulnerable party. The guarantee has to be enforceable and ideally instantaneous.
That means the success of the compact really rests on those shared scoreboard metrics, which, you're right, we should discuss. But let's shift our focus for a moment now to the role of centralized power versus local power, because that's another major fault line in this whole debate. The liberty-focused case expresses, well, deep skepticism that centralized bureaucracies, particularly those focused on institutional diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, can be truly effective. Our concern is that these systems often politicize institutions, they can chill dissent, and sometimes require mandatory ideological training or adherence to specific group-based preferences, like explicit hiring quotas or, rigid ideological litmus tests, which, we argue, undermines the principle of merit and individual opportunity.
I come at it from a different perspective, obviously. While I absolutely acknowledge the vulnerability that these policies can result in bureaucratic overreach and generate pushback, I defend DEI as an absolutely necessary remedial tool. We're not just talking about adding political language here. We are talking about targeted, data-driven interventions designed specifically to identify and fix structural barriers that, frankly, race-neutral policies often miss entirely. The objective isn't merely ideological. It's intensely practical. Things like targeted recruitment funnels to address known racial gaps in university admissions, or climate initiatives designed to improve first-year STEM pass rates for underrepresented students, and rigorous data transparency to actually measure progress. The potential for closing critical access gaps in admissions, in completion rates, in promotions. That potential justifies the intervention, even with the acknowledged risk of bureaucratic creep. We need policies that enforce the idea that identity doesn't determine success. And sometimes that requires specific, data-driven interventions that look at group outcomes to diagnose systemic failure.
That's a compelling argument for intentional remediation. I see that. But have you considered the efficiency and the sustainability of some of these programs? The shared scoreboard metrics, as the source material suggests, imply we must assess the cost per outcome, and perhaps the failure of many DEI programs to meet their stated sunset clauses, meaning they become permanent, expensive fixtures without necessarily demonstrating proportionate success in closing the identified gaps. Contrast that kind of centralized intervention with the plank prioritizing parental rights and local control. This focus ensures curriculum transparency, parental notification regarding sensitive materials in schools, and local discretion over educational standards. This approach prefers community discussion and local choice over rapid, centralized mandates that can bypass public deliberation. We tend to prefer remediation that focuses on opportunity for individuals rather than mandates driving towards group outcomes.
Local control certainly promotes democratic engagement, I agree. But it often promotes entrenched inequality, too. I mean, just look at the disparities in educational access and resources that local control has historically exacerbated. That said, I completely agree that accountability for remediation programs is absolutely non-negotiable, which brings us back, I think, fully to the shared scoreboard concept. Both of our policy frameworks, the liberty-focused one and the access-focused one, must ultimately be judged by real-world metrics. It really is the ultimate test of both sets of policies.
Absolutely. We move past the abstract arguments about intentions, and we look at empirical results. What's actually happening on the ground?
Right. So for the access-focused framework, the metrics that matter are pretty clear. What is the actual time to service for protected groups after seeking a necessary accommodation? Are we seeing measurable reductions in, say, racial disparities in maternal morbidity or mortality rates? Are the identified structural barriers genuinely being fixed? If the policies fail these outcome tests, then yes, they must be reformed or sunsetted.
And from the liberty perspective, our scoreboard focuses on different elements of friction, perhaps. Are the conscience exemptions granted for expressive services truly limited, or are they spilling over into general commerce? What is the cost per outcome of various DEI initiatives? And specifically regarding those live and let live compacts, how successful are the referrals? Are they actually occurring within the time-bound mandate? Success from this view means the reduction of both regulatory friction and the friction caused by denial of service.
So to summarize my position, the focus remains fundamentally on guaranteeing that identity does not determine life chances or access. And this, I argue, requires enforceable civil rights baselines and a willingness to utilize accountable, data-driven interventions like DEI to address persistent structural barriers. The threat of real-world exclusion is simply too great to rely only on voluntary compliance or sort of race-neutral hope.
And I will maintain that a truly pluralistic and free society depends critically on robust protection for individual liberty, especially freedom of conscience against compelled speech. We must ensure that cultural and moral disagreements are mediated through engaged, local democratic processes, not unilaterally imposed from the top down. And we must defend the right of parents to guide their own children's moral development.
It is notable, though, that the most viable bridging ideas identified in the source material, like the necessity of those live and let live compacts we discussed, and the shared commitment to actually measuring outcomes via a shared scoreboard, they do suggest that our foundational values might not be entirely mutually exclusive, even if the prioritization is constantly, and perhaps rightly, in tension.
Indeed.
The very existence of mechanisms that could simultaneously protect limited conscience and guarantee timely access proves that we're not just debating abstract ideals here, but practical architecture. How do we build this?
The challenge ultimately for the listener is weighing the strength of the evidence presented for prioritizing one foundational value, liberty or equality, when designing the rules that govern our public life.
And we leave that decision with you.